This is the Amazing Education Podcast. Powered by the Ames Community School District, I'm your host, Eric Smith. On today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Jeff Hawkins. We're going to have an amazing conversation about the importance of modeling classroom strategies during meetings to administrators and teachers, and how that modeling can be used in the classroom. All right, well, thank you, Dr. Hawkins, for being on this episode of the Amazing Education Podcast. I'm super excited that you're here.
I'm very excited to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
So, I've been in meetings with you, and the first time I saw it, I'll be honest with you, it was kind of fascinating to me because, it's a bunch of administrators, and, we all know each other, and you're talking, and all of a sudden you stop the meeting for a moment and demonstrate a strategy that you used, and really what you're doing is that you're modeling that strategy for us, and I found it to be completely fascinating, and so I wanted to talk more about that.
Sure. Yeah, I would love to talk about that. I think the old adage, right, that good teaching is good teaching, really applies to whoever we're leading in that teaching. And so I more oftentimes get the opportunity to lead adults in their learning, but I still think we want to approach that learning with really good teaching strategies. And many instructional frameworks that would describe really what quality teaching looks like would include modeling and being really specific and intentional about the thinking that the quote-unquote expert is bringing to that conversation.
And so I find it interesting that you are very intentional about being intentional as well. I don't know if that's a thing, but
yeah.
So kind of walk through like your intent of doing that, because we're in a room full of adults and we're talking and kind of even nuts and bolts things as far as how a school district operates, and you use a strategy and then you explain what that strategy is. And so what do you hope happens then from that meeting?
Sure.
Beyond that meeting?
The reason that, so when you talk about being intentional about being intentional, I appreciate that phrasing. So when I'm in a meeting that I've planned to be in, I will have planned through which strategies I want to use in that meeting and how I'm going to share those strategies. I view every opportunity that I meet with people as an opportunity to educate. And so my goal is to bring new and or additional strategies to that conversation with the hopes then that I build the repertoire and the skills and strategy bank, if you will, of the people in the meeting. Because what I'm hopeful for is that people will leave, one, seeing the benefit of the strategy and how they can use it, but then also the benefit of being really well planned and intentional about the use of strategies. So I guess my hope is that as I model strategies, that the people I'm modeling them for will go back and incorporate that into their practice. And I will say, when I was a principal and walking into classrooms, I had several opportunities to watch teachers utilize and explain the strategy that they were using with kids. And even in my brief time here in Ames, I've had the opportunity to be in buildings and watch other leaders explain the so I see it come to fruition in which people start to become more conscientious about the strategies that they're using.
I mean, that's kind of have to be a cool feeling, though, knowing that you see that come to. I mean, because that is ultimately your intent.
Mm-hmm. That is exactly right.
You want it to happen in our buildings and in our classrooms,
right?
And you see it happen. So, for you professionally, like, what was the origin of this as far as operating meetings in this way? Sure. Like, did it start, like, clearly you had to make deliberate steps to research these strategies and then be very intentional about the ways you research and then deliver this in a meeting. So, like, how long have you been doing this?
I've been doing this for a very long time. Probably for the last decade, about every meeting that I would be in, or particularly if it was a learning-oriented meeting, I would be bringing to it some sort of intentional strategy that I intend to share. And where it came from was the recognition that it probably comes from the same place that our research base comes from, right? So there are strategies that teachers can use in the classroom that have a high impact and a high leverage on student learning. And when teachers are conscientious about using those appropriately and with more frequency, students perform better. Well, good meetings don't just happen, right? Well-led adult learning doesn't just materialize out of nowhere. And so what I began to realize was the amount of thinking and intentionality that was brought to making good adult learning go the way that it needed to go is something that I could share. I could share the content of the learning, but I could share the intentionality so that I could draw people back into the intentionality of their own planning. Mm-hmm. So if I can take a few minutes to share a strategy and not have it interrupt the flow of the meeting, they too can take a few minutes in a classroom, or a principal can take that same opportunity in their professional learning with adults to share that same type of thing. And so I think it increases again, that concept of intentionality as we plan. And I just think it also increases the cognizance. So, for example, if I know that according to Marzano's research, summarizing at the end of a conversation or a reading has an effect size of 1.0 in increasing student achievement, and I can articulate that and point that out, the odds of a principal and or teacher then restating that and then using that strategy in their classroom increases significantly.
So we're going to walk through in a little bit some of your favorite strategies, so just so that we can be very deliberate as far as showing what some of these are. But I was doing some research on some professional standards for educational leaders, and part of it is to build capacity of our school personnel and our teachers. Sure. And I've been in meetings with you, and I will say that it does not impact the flow of the meeting at all. In fact, it's almost a little bit of a nice, I'm going to pay attention again, part of the meeting, and everyone's engaged already, but it's a nice way to even break up the meeting because we're talking about something different. And so I find providing, these unique learning opportunities, especially for teachers, is got to be incredibly valuable because we all know, the school day is busy. You're trying to manage kids, you're trying to manage content, there's just a lot going on with students, and so I think as a district, I find this just to be a very smart way to introduce new learning without it really even feeling like learning for teachers.
Well, and it's also, first of all, I appreciate the idea that the experience hasn't interrupted the learning for you. That's good. That's part of the process. There actually is some literature that suggests modeling, which is what I'm doing when I do that, actually increases engagement, right? So,
I could see that.
Sometimes the old thinking would be that if the quote unquote teacher is talking, that people drift off. But when we do modeling the right way, when we're really getting deep into our thinking and our intentionality and why things operate the way they do, there's some literature that suggests engagement increases. So that's interesting that it matches your experience. You're right. Teachers are super busy, and so I don't approach a meeting with teachers or principals with the assumption that they would have read research-based, conversation around the effect size of a graphic organizer or the effect size of a summarizing strategy or a vocabulary strategy. So if I can incorporate something into a meeting that just puts it there for them in a little tidbit as a reminder, you can do this too.
Yeah.
If I can let them know, here's the impact that this has on learning according to the research base, and I can model how to weave that into learning, I've really taken the ability to read an article and kind of boiled it down into a 30-second snippet where I'm actually demonstrating that strategy and modeling it in real time.
Yeah. I just find it to be a very smart way for a district leader to do that for teachers. And I reiterate it again. Teachers, they are so busy with so many other things. The last thing they're going to probably do is dive into a research journal
Yeah.
to find.
Well, they may or they may not, but as you talked about, it's a way to build capacity
Yeah.
in the moment. So in addition to the content of the meeting, when I'm intentional about the strategies, I'm building both the content of whatever we want to talk about, but I'm building people's strategy bank, and they're getting to see how it might be modeled in an actual meeting. And so
That's a huge thing.
yeah, it builds a lot of capacity.
I agree. And a couple other words that I wrote down, just thinking about how impactful this could be, is that I find it to be empowering, motivating for teachers, because I think, and even administrators who may, principals then may model it for their teachers, is that, wow, let's test this out. Let's see how effective it really can be. And I think oftentimes, because the research supports this, it is effective, and you can see a difference in the classroom or in a meeting that you're running, and you're giving it to them, which is I find it to be a gift.
So one of the strategies that I find I often end up modeling and talking with people about are strategies for regaining attention when you've released that. So a very common instructional model in a classroom would be the teacher does something, they release the students to do work, and then they want to pull the students back together. Well, how we pull students back together, there's some strategy that you can approach to that, right? And I find that that's one of the things that I most commonly end up sharing with people is various strategies to do that in a quick and respectful way, because no teacher really wants to yell at kids, hey, could you please pay attention?
But that is what we default to.
But if we don't have strategies, sometimes that's what we do.
Yep.
So what was fun for me is recently I was in a school,
Yeah.
and I had modeled that strategy for the principal,
Yep.
who had then modeled it for their staff and had said, hey, I was in a meeting with Dr. Hawkins, he modeled this, I want to model it for you.
Yeah.
And I had a teacher approach me and say, I just want you to know that it worked. And I said, what do you mean it worked? And she said, I was in my class, and I'd released them like like we do, and I wanted them to get back together, and I tried that strategy that my principal had modeled for me, and I want you to know in about 8 seconds the class was back together, and I didn't have to yell at them. And so
let's
those
walk
are kind
through
of
some of
bucket
those.
filling. Right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, not only does it work with adults, but it works with students as well. So talk through what a couple of those were, because I've been a part of that.
Sure. So again, I mentioned, how to pull a group back together. I mentioned summarizing a little bit. I oftentimes find that I am either modeling an engagement strategy. So in a meeting, there's the content we want to talk about, and then there's the process that we want to use to talk about it. And when people carefully plan, they plan just as much about how to discuss it as they do what to discuss. And so when I can help model different strategies to keep people engaged and thinking, right, there's another thing, quite frankly, that I model quite a bit is just brain-based research. There's brain-based research that would suggest anywhere between 15 and 18 minutes is the maximum amount of attention you're going to get from an adult.
Yep, I could see that.
Sustained attention.
Yep.
And so then having a bank of strategies to weave into what oftentimes professional development is going to be significantly longer than 15 to 18 minutes. So I've got to have a bank of strategies in order to get people up and moving and processing and conversing. And so I find that I end up modeling a lot of engagement strategies.
Yep.
Again, some of that brain-based research. And then, quite frankly, I find that I like to model a lot of research-based strategies, either from Hattie or Marzano, that have a high effect size on producing. So again, my hope is that they end up trickling into the classroom. And so I find that I model things like summarizing strategies, feedback strategies, formative assessment strategies. A strategy that I'm pretty intentional about modeling is establishing purpose, right? So there's a high correlate or a high effect size between establishing right away what is the purpose of our meeting, what is the purpose of our learning today, and being clear about that.
Okay, yeah.
And just, I mean, that's a lot of times people go to a meeting and they say, hey, the main thing we need to talk about is blah, 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 blah.
Correct.
But they may not stop and say, by the way, when I'm intentional about telling you the main point of what we're learning, the odds of us actually accomplishing that significantly increase. Well, that's what happens in a classroom.
Yeah.
If you tell kids what they're about to learn, the odds of them actually learning it increase significantly.
For sure.
And there's a solid research base behind that.
Well, and I think that's the difference between an adult meeting, just saying that at the beginning of a meeting, but then also pointing it out as in, hey, I want to point out that we're identifying the purpose here.
Right.
I mean, it just sinks in a little bit better.
Yeah. Yep.
I think it'd be valuable to be a little bit more specific on so if a teacher is watching or listening to this,
Sure.
What would be a couple things? And so maybe we could start with the bringing the group back together. Like, what were
Sure.
some specific things that?
I'll give you two strategies
Yeah.
that I've found to be highly effective in bringing a group back together. The first is simply a raised hand. Now, the key to that strategy is that whoever sees that raised hand also needs to raise their hand. And so fairly quickly, and it doesn't take long to get a group of adults or kids, quite frankly, to understand
Yep.
the routine of that, is that if I've raised my hand and you raised your hand and we stop talking when we see a raised hand, then the room quiets pretty quickly. Typically, I can have a highly engaged, highly active adult meeting, and with a raised hand strategy, I can get people back together in around 10 seconds.
It works.
Yes, it does.
I've been a
work.
part of it. I've seen it
Yeah.
work with students. And
Yep.
and I think the key to that one would be teaching that strategy to the students, being very direct and explicit with the students
Yes.
about this is the point. So when you see this, also raise your hand, and then other students will see it.
Yeah, you have to
And-
teach the routine.
Right.
Another strategy that I've pointed out to different audiences that can be used to bring people back together is to read to people. There is something about the cadence
Yeah.
of our voice, the tone and the lilt, that when read to, we stop and listen to
Yep.
being read to. And so for a long time now, I have modeled that if you just, it even doesn't matter whether you care what you're reading, just that. And again, typically 15 seconds.
Yeah.
Usually when I find that I'm reading something to a group to pull them back together, I rarely get past sentence number 2, maybe
Yeah.
into sentence number 3, and then the group is back together.
So that one took me by surprise because you did it with us in a meeting without talking about it first, and it worked without talking about it, and then we talked about it. And so that one, I think if I had just read that or if you just told me it,
Might not
may not have believed it right away, but
Yeah, it works pretty easily.
it worked, and so that was fascinating.
Yeah.
So maybe some of the specific engagement strategies as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I think for me the key to engagement strategies is me being very cognizant of my pacing. So I try to understand and have an eye on the clock and understand what that means then in correlation to brain-based research. So sometimes I have a process planned. I'll give you a good example. So maybe I'm leading a conversation over a reading, and I want to interrupt that reading with a note-taking strategy, maybe like a text marking strategy, and then there's a gist strategy in which you would basically do some summarizing of the main points, right? So that would be one strategy. I would explain the strategy. It breaks up the reading,
Yep.
right? But then with that, I now have the opportunity to do things like a standing meeting where I can get people out of their chair and walking around the room talking with somebody.
Yep.
Sometimes I can actually use the physical room, or I choose to use the physical room, like saying, okay, if you believe in A, go stand in this corner and talk with the other people about why A is the thinking. Or if
Yeah.
you believe in Z, go stand in this corner and talk about why Z is the right philosophy
Yeah.
here. So I can get people out of their chairs and moving and talking. So writing, moving, talking with people would be ways that I can break up conversation or reading to promote just a more active brain and more engagement in the work.
And I think there's also some really great formative assessments that you can do with these strategies as well. I know yourself and a colleague of ours, Dr. Dumas, uses a fist of 5. And then I think there was a thumbs up,
thumbs down.
Right.
Yeah.
And these are very simple things.
Very simple strategies.
But they are things that students have to engage with, like just to get a sense of where you're at, not right, not wrong, but where are you at on this idea or this question or this topic. And it can be used in a number of different ways. And an effective teacher can have a number of these that they can use throughout a class.
Right, without a doubt. And so there's some keys to using them successfully, like the thumbs up, thumbs down, or the fist to five. What I always try to model for teachers is you don't ask that and then just glance around the room and move on. Like, you have to be intentional about looking at each participant.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, because otherwise you send the message that you don't really care about everybody's answer. And so if you're going to do a fist to five, you got to make sure you get that feedback from each kid. Or if you're going to do a thumbs up, thumbs down, you got to make sure that you see where you're at with each learner.
Right.
Because otherwise you actually reinforce the message you don't want to have.
So that's actually a very good point to that specific strategy is actually be intentional on how you use it as well, not just using it.
Yeah, you don't want to just use a fist to five strategy and be like, oh, all right, I can check that one off. I used fist to five. Because if you're not intentional about looking for each child's response, then it becomes pretty obvious, or each learner's response, it becomes pretty obvious that you really weren't too interested in everybody's responses.
But using it effectively can send even another message without even saying it, as in, I value.
Yeah, I care where your learning is at. I want to know where you're at, and you're at, and you're at, and you're at.
Yeah.
Right. I care.
I love every part of that. So I think we touched on this, but I think it'd be interesting to sort of recap it, is what this does for students. So we just touched on a great one, as far as I care about your learning.
Yeah.
But what some of the other ones, as far as the engagement strategy or bringing them back together, like what does this do for students? Like, how is this impactful in our classroom if we use these?
Sure. Well, there's probably two different ways to think about the use of strategies that it can impact kids, right? So one way is obviously our kids are going to participate better and focus on our learning if they're engaged. There's all sorts of process strategies that we can bring to the way that we design instruction, because an engaged learner is much more likely to be successful than an unengaged learner. So that's one way it impacts kids. But then there's also these strategies that have a research base around them on impact of achievement. So whether that's graphic organizers, response to formative assessment, setting purpose, summarizing strategies. I've mentioned several of these already, but those are strategies that are high leverage strategies that engage the brain or give me information as a teacher that are shown through a research base, through the science of education, to actually impact achievement. And so the beauty of being someone who's intentional about modeling their strategies is I can build some capacity in the adults that I work with in order to create processes that are engaging, and that we pull people in and out of effectively, run an effective meeting. But then I can also give them and build their capacity and strategies that's ultimately going to give our kids an advantage in learning, right? Help solidify that learning outcome, which is what we're all achieving for.
It's what we're all about. I think that's absolutely great. I think we could talk about this a lot longer, and I fully anticipate we'll probably end up doing some further work on this. I just think it's growth areas, I think, are wonderful, and this is an area that I think everyone can be more intentional about and get better at, because ultimately it's going to, like you said, make for a better meeting. It's going to make for better student outcomes. It's going to make for better classrooms, and I just think it's great all along. So we're going to wrap up this episode, and as you know, we're in the business of amazing things, and so I want to give you an opportunity to share something amazing in the world of education, in your world.
Sure. So one of the things that I love about where education is going right now, I see it playing out in Ames Community Schools, and I'm sure it's playing out across our nation, and that is the goal or the intent, the intentional work of schools to create really authentic experiences for our students, right? So I see more and more opportunities for kids to maybe get out of their desk, get out of their classroom, engage in real world problem solving, real world experience. So for example, I just got done with a conversation in our high school building in which we're planning for a student enterprise where students will run a real business, making a real product, practice marketing and selling and money handling and all of those things that an entrepreneur would need to do as a part of entrepreneurship. So not just textbook learning, but real world application. And I'm in other conversations with other teachers where we're talking about how do we get outside of the school building and get into nature and discover some of the things that are going on in our natural world, some of the problems that are going on, and how do we become active participants in solving community-based or world-based problems, and the authenticity that brings to the learning environment and the amount of engagement that kids have when they get to genuinely solve a problem for a real audience is just amazing. And it's something that I'm proud to be able to be a part of in education right now.
I think it's great. I think that could be an entire episode having that conversation because that is where it should go.
Yeah, it's fun stuff.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Hawkins, for being willing to be on this show.
Yeah, I appreciate it. This was fun. Thank you very much.
Take care. Thanks.
You bet.